Hi, this is Tim Story, director, and this is the 20th Century Fox logo. Love that logo. Of course, like everybody, we did our little thing where we had them do a special fan for Marvel logo. This planet, it was interesting. We first did this planet, of course, where we're going to show a little taste of Galactus here. We had to make sure this planet did not look like Earth. Originally, we made it a green and blue planet and had to change that because people kept confusing it with Earth. We tried to put a couple of moons in the back there, but it just didn't, prove that it was not Earth. So we ended up changing it. This idea of having Galactus in the front of the movie was an idea that came later in post production when we knew that the movie gets to a grim thing about it, but we wanted kind of how most movies will show what's going to happen later at the beginning. We wanted people to first get a glimpse of what might happen to Earth so that when the surfer comes to Earth, you know that, okay, everything can't be hunky dory when this guy comes and visits the planet. So that was an introduction. So you kind of knew that we were dealing with more serious material in this movie than in the first. This, of course, is a truncated version of the title sequence that we initially made much longer, but decided at some point that we wanted to get into the movie sooner. And we decided to just go right into our galaxy and get to the surfer flying, of course, as you will see in a second, flying past the moon and, of course, into Earth. So that was something we changed. For some reason, I can't seem to get the long, cool title sequences in my movies. Just always end up cutting them, although we planned them quite early. The idea with the surfer entering into Earth was always the concept of having him as a comet so that we could use the big reveal for everybody, the audience, when he comes through the Chrysler building, which happens a little bit later on. Funny thing about it is, we ultimately found problems, which I will talk about in a little bit. This is not. We were in Vancouver. That Mount Fuji is put back there. This idea that he changes the atmosphere and weather and all of this stuff was something we came up with quite early. We figured in bringing him to Earth, we didn't want to start off with you seeing just the surfer, but we had to create a reason why his presence on Earth would cause a global problem. The idea with this movie originally was to make it a global movie in which many cities, many countries were being affected upon his entry. The scene in the airport was actually a leftover. Originally, we were supposed to have an action sequence at the top of this movie, and that's why they were going to be coming back from wherever that situation was. And at some point, we did take it out, and but the airport remained because we kind of liked some of the gags with it, and we felt it was a pretty good intro to our characters to see them in the normal life of now that they're celebrities, and the fact that Ben now has clothes and he's very comfortable, quote unquote, in his skin, no pun intended. And so we used this scene to intro our guys. I don't know if it played as much as I wanted to, but there's this idea that they have tried to have a wedding many, many times, and for whatever reasons, it's been disrupted. And not sure if that ever really got across in the movie, but that was definitely an underlining thing that we were trying to intro into the movie. All of this is just kind of the ideas taken from the tone of what the comic books were. The fan four have always been very domestic, for lack of a better word, and we just wanted to show them in and about the environment. We got into all the fun gags that would just immediately introduce our characters and let you know where they are now. So that's what mainly this scene is all about. This next thing that, I tried to introduce with Chris in talking about endorsements and all this other stuff is to really try to intro that now they are quite well off, and the fact that they make money not only from Reed's inventions, but picture them as a bunch of Tiger Woods. They just have a lot of endorsements. And so we figured, try to get that in there because that would explain the remodel of the Baxter building and everything else. The great Chickless. Michael Chiklis, we were able to redesign his suit on this film and make the cracks deeper, but even more importantly, the cracks on his suit allowed for air to flow inside of his suit because in the last movie he had absolutely no ventilation. Here's the Baxter building. There's not that many shots of it, but as you can see, it is totally revamped, redesigned, and there is a four on top, which we will see later in the wedding. And even the interior here is something that I wanted to absolutely do in the sense that I wanted to show that they now have money and that they are completely well off. And so the Baxter building was completely designed without trying to match anything that I did on the first movie. And at some point in the planning of it, the questions were asked, how do you deal with that question? I said, you know what, I'm not going to deal with the question. I'm just going to change it and make it what I feel it should be. And I think people will get it. To do. Hey. Here was once again another idea that was a cool little gag that we show that the fan four have some endorsements from all types of places, and that of course with their costumes they would have to wear advertisement on that Johnny's of course is with, but Reed is not. That whole gag was a long discussion in reproduction because, does he split his thumb to make two thumbs or is it just moving really fast? We opted for he can actually split his thumbs up to make two thumbs. And although gross, I think would be a good trait to have. The concept behind there's a big computer screen that we just saw a little while ago, and you'll see it again in this wide shot, is actually taken from some of the comic books. Ultimate Extinction, I believe it was, where they showed Reed Richards inside the Baxter building. It had this huge screen, and I kind of lifted the concept of Reed having one huge, humongous computer screen in his office. Just chose to surround him constantly with computer screens just because it's great for lighting, and also two, that's what he's all about. Disturbances and cosmic. So here we have the intro to the surfer as he's kind of, you would assume, made a loop around the world and ended up going past what we consider the Doom Castle. The idea of, Latveria, it was great to have it inside the movie because at first there were questions whether we would have it, but ultimately we decided to put it in. And of course, the backstory of why Doom comes back to life deals with the cosmic energy of the surfer bringing him back to life, which was an idea early on that, we got into this whole thing of, okay, the guy last time we saw him was a statue. How do we bring him back to being, alive? We also tapped into this idea that maybe the same cosmic power that the Surfer is involved with that he got from Galactus was actually maybe the same cosmic power or storm that created the Fan Four. So we never went too far with that idea, that concept, but at the same time, we definitely used it as kind of like a source of some ideas. This is one of those gags where it just this kid right here with the big hair, he was just an extra that we had, and literally, I remember my first AD, Lee Cleary, just bringing him over and showing me and said, "Oh, we should do something with this guy," and I thought it was a such a great look, so we put him in.
Good evening and welcome.
Our doorman that we used in the first movie, you might remember, he was thrown through the doors, and although we really didn't answer the question whether he was killed or not, obviously he wasn't because he is back, and it was great to have a cameo of this. Andre Brower was pretty much my first choice for the general when we thought about, first of all, he's one of my favorite actors. When I originally saw him in Glory, he was just such an awesome actor that I've always wanted to work with him. And luckily, he said yes to this. I should also mention the receptionist that we have, Roberta, was a robot in the original Fantastic Four comic book, and we decided to use her as a hologram, which I thought actually was an easier route to having her in the movie than to try to create some type of robot or something like that. So I wanted to give an homage to the comic book character. Here's a concept in terms of when Reed is about to start stretching. One of the things that, once again, I was not able to totally get into the movie was an explanation for his clothes, stretching and this and that. And at some point, I just decided creatively. One of the things that's so hard that we spent almost 6 months, and I just didn't have the time to do that in the original film, was stretching skin. It took us many months to get the stretching skin right. And I knew I didn't have that kind of time. And so when I have him stretching and doing things like this, I had always wanted to show that Reed pretty much started making clothes, and it's in the comic books as well, from the unstable molecule, started making clothes for himself and for any of the actors. So Johnny has clothes that he could catch on fire, but say if he had a suit, he could catch on fire with it. And when he flamed off, the suit was still there. So in this one, unfortunately, I wasn't able to explain that. I did have ideas on explaining it, but ultimately it just became, shoe leather. But I always thought about the reasoning behind why his clothes are stretching here when normally they don't stretch. But what are you gonna do? You can't explain everything, and it definitely was something I was going for in the movie. It's not a forgotten point. This idea of the general having a history with Reed was something that I always thought in terms of bringing this character to the movie. You didn't want to have a character that comes and introduces himself, and they have to then get to know one another before they can start to have kind of a conflict in terms of their relationship. I thought it'd be better to have a character that already knew Reed, already went through some history, and as I tried to do here in explaining what happened with them a long time ago, you try to pick up the story farther in than opposed to starting at the beginning. And that was the point of having them have some history so that I could get straight to the conflict. His voice is so great. I have like the two best voices in many films here with Lawrence and Andre. I should point out, well, Garrett here, the young lady to your right, who was such a such a cool person and just a really good actress that we had a lot of fun with, and I needed that person that, although sexy, could portray some type of officer. Take a look at this. This is the first introduction to the craters. For those of you who have seen the deleted scenes, I wanted so desperately to have a scene that introduced the crater specifically before this scene that ultimately we did, opted not to do. But this was the first time that the craters are being introduced. Now, I should point out that in dealing with the craters, in the comic books, the Surfer pretty much called Galactus to come to Earth and do its thing. But one thing that was never kind of really gone into is what he did on Earth while he was calling Galactus to come see him. And so we had to figure out some action for him to be doing because he couldn't just be flying around the Earth like a fly and just doing his thing. So the craters made sense to us that he would create holes in the Earth so that when Galactus did come, he could just almost like a suction cup just lock in and pull the energy from not only from the surface but also from the interior of the planet. So that's where the craters come from. They are not as far as I know, they're not a comic book reference.
Wow, yeah. They can build a sense.
This was a cool night. Actors love it when you can grab a shot in a oneer, and once you get it right, you can leave.
Thank you.
So here, of course, we have the intro of Doctor Doom or Victor as he comes back to life and has to get this mask off his face. It's kind of a concept that I thought about pretty early on. It would be pretty cool, fun to know that he has to literally pry this thing off his face. And, we intro that the bad guy is not dead. That, once again, is literally an idea taken out of the comics where you see a picture of his ancestry. One of the things that really they went into with comic books is always a history on Doctor Doom and, where his lineage and where he comes from and the fact that he's royalty in this land of Latveria.
Yeah. If I had
As usual, taken from a Jack Kirby stance, having Reed work on huge machines and this and that is always a cool thing to try to grab in. So here he is definitely working on something. It's never been addressed how Reed built all this stuff, but I don't think it's really necessary.
why
Well, here we are introducing the fact that their celebrity status is quite huge and that, everybody wants to be a part of this wedding. There was an interesting idea that we thought about it very, very early on before, and at some point just opted not to do it, and that was to have all these crowds constantly trying to bum rush and get inside the wedding, and at some point they actually break in and get upstairs, and it becomes this big mass craziness as the helicopter comes down. So that was something we were thinking about doing, and just time is always against you in big films like this, especially with the weather as crazy it is in Vancouver.
Thank you.
The building to your left is completely digital. This building that we found in the middle of Vancouver was one of the closest things we could find that showed that we were on a rooftop in some fashion.
Invitation, sir.
The great Stanley. All of us on the set were really happy with the cameo because we think for it to play such a specific reference to an old comic book was really good. And for those of you who don't know, in the comic books, Stanley and Jack Kirby actually try to come to the wedding of Sue and Reed, and in our turned away at the door. They have on top hats and all of that stuff, and they're turned away, and we thought to pay some homage to that.
Aren't normal.
Early on, we had this idea that they would choose to maybe stop doing their superhero stuff. And this was a scene that we devised to basically give the idea that she doesn't like this celebrity world and that she's really, really against it, her and Reed. And I tried to, wherever possible, sprinkle that point in so that you know where this idea of not wanting to be superheroes or whatever comes from. This little simple gag that we did where Reed's legs are here and his head is up here is funny. I walked in that day and just said, guys, there's got to be something here that we can kind of mess with in terms of Reed being able to stretch that doesn't have to cost us a lot of money. And we literally just had his stand in, put on his pants and be lower and have Johan stay on a little riser in which he could bring his head up. So once again, it's quick gag that we every now and then try to have a little bit of fun with these guys. Once again, another machine. These machines are always just big and, this is taken right out of the book of Jack Kirby. I knew I had to create some type of sensor that he'd be working on, but the look of it, I literally started to open up the old comic books and said, pick that shape, pick that shape. There was a lot of circle stuff that I had in the original movie and decided to take out because I found that when you put in circles in some of this technology, it makes the technology look old and make it look like 1950s technology as opposed to a more advanced version. And that's what Reed is all about, is advanced science.
Okay.
I love having, Alicia and Ben together. I love these two actors together. They just find moments that are just really, really fun and have really taken on this relationship quite well. One of the things that I tried to do more and more with this film that wasn't always successful with was giving them a little bit more of a story that, unfortunately, if you watch the deleted scenes, you'll see there was a kind of a little subplot that we had going on with them, which later introduces the puppet master maybe for a film 3 if there was going to be one.
All right, I'm just concerned.
This, once again, is just images from Victor Von Doom that I saw in comic books. There was always this idea that Dr. Doom, Victor, was always looking in on the Fan Four from behind the shadows with computers and all of this stuff. And we tried to hint at it in the first film. And then with this film, I just went all the way for it. I just gave him the chair. I gave him the zillions of monitors, gave him everything.
Thank you. You're welcome.
There's a little gag we're doing here with Alicia where she's able to pick up on Johnny anytime he comes in the room. And what I was trying to do is hint at something that was kind of, I believe, hinted at in the comic book, is that Alicia, although blind, there's a little bit of a sense that's heightened. I mean, I have heard and read that, people who are missing maybe one sense makes the other senses stronger. But here we were actually trying to go a little bit farther where, maybe Alicia has a little bit of a superpower in the sense that she's able to sense things that people just can't do. I love the way Chris played this scene. He's such a talented actor. One thing I believe 100% is that he is really going to grow and do some amazing work. He's quite great, and he and Jessica played this scene kind of the way I've always envisioned it, just simple and emotional, and there is this talk of the father, and we purposely made it a little, a little bit vague of what happened to him. And saying dad would be proud, you could think immediately, okay, he must be dead. But then again, is he? In some literature I've read, he was killed. In some other literature or some of the newer versions, they show him alive, of course, when they were younger. So I always wanted to keep that open because in the event there was a third, it might be some information that, someone could use in the sense of maybe the father is alive. This is definitely the wedding that I pictured it could be. I made a lot of pictures of this early on about how big this wedding should be. And I also needed it for the Jeopardy because I knew without a shadow of a doubt that in some way this wedding would be disrupted, and definitely went for the more people, the better. What of course would have been the greatest would have been to have some superheroes in the audience. But, you can't always cross and use everything that you read in the comic books. This once again kind of harkens back to the idea of having the media just crash this wedding, and really wanted to play that up, but at some point we didn't want to make it too confusing. So very early on in the planning of the film, I knew that the first point to pretty much, throw this film into gear was the arrival of the surfer and the fact that he would disrupt this wedding, so that I could use that as the fact of them having to try to get back to the wedding throughout the whole film. The idea that his presence creates power outages, weird weather patterns, all of this stuff was just always something that we kept going with. The idea of the Silver Surfer is just making even his very presence create problems. We had to be very careful with making him too powerful, but at the same time, it was a good thing to do with his character, I believe. This is where CGI really helps you. All the rotors, of course, are CGI. The helicopter in those two shots right there is actually real on a rig that we, of course, at some point cut out. But, CGI work is just so good nowadays. It's pretty intriguing what you can make. The surfer chase was probably one of the first pictures, along with the wedding, that I drew in concept. I always knew that the surfer flies, Johnny flies. There was no way in the world you're going to have this movie without these two going toe to toe. And the idea of him going through buildings was something that we kind of started messing with early on, because if you read the comic books and the definition of what the power the surfer has, he can change matter, pretty much any matter, into whatever he desires. And that really kind of answered questions for us. Okay, so that means he can walk through walls. He can walk through anything, because technically if I made a wall here be water, I could walk straight through it. And so we started to use that in, what could be cool. The idea of him going through the board, which happens there, was once again, what if, he probably could become one with the board, or he could definitely go through it. And we just chose to have a really good time with introducing that concept. The whole chase of the surfer was a hard concept because once you get them out into the open like this, there's not a lot of obstacles that would get in their way because why wouldn't you just fly above it? So we always had to keep them lower to the ground and improve the idea of speed and just obstacles that they would have to deal with. I guess I should speak a little bit about the CGI of the surfer. This is my first adventure into having a CGI character, although we did do some of that stuff in the first film with Johnny when you put the fire on him and you make Sue invisible. Technically, she's a CGI person, but to create a character from scratch in CGI form it's kind of like tedious movement planning, but at the same time, it does allow you to creatively do anything you want to do. And Weta, the guys who created the surfer here, they're just masters at doing those kind of things with them dealing with Gollum and King Kong. And here they gave us, once again, a character that just resonated as far as movement and everything. Then, of course, the great Lawrence Fishburne doing the voice of the surfer. There's a funny story with Lawrence. I remember running into him in a restaurant and we sat and talked about the Fantastic Four and the Silver Surfer and Galactus. And originally he was like, let me be Galactus. And we knew pretty early on that we weren't going to realize him in the guy form or whatever you want to call it. But we did always keep the idea open that he could possibly be the voice of the surfer, because if we were going for a strong voice like his, I thought it would be pretty awesome. We didn't want the surfer's voice to sound too lighter because we didn't want it to sound robotic. So having somebody with a little bit more bass register was something we totally got into early on.
Surfer.
Of course, for those of you who know, the beginnings of Johnny feeling a little bit weird is what's about to happen.
Before it attacks again. Richards, find me another way to track it.
We tried hard to figure out ways to use their powers in everyday life, and kind of that's what makes the Fantastic Four different from, I think, all the other comic books, is because they do constantly use their powers to do mundane, trivial things. And in this case, an argument. Many times I've tried to get away from somebody when I'm in an argument, and to have the power to stop somebody from doing that is something that I think any of us would use to our advantage. This idea of the power switch originally came from Avi Arad, who had the idea that they should be able to switch powers, and he brought this idea up early on. And I remember being kind of against it a little bit because I didn't know where exactly we were going with it. And at some point I embraced, this idea, especially when after we started to block out the surfer chase a little bit more, and knew that Johnny would be in direct contact with the Silver Surfer, and that allowed for the opportunity for him to be in the situation where he would switch with the guys. But at some point I embraced the idea that they could switch back and forth because it gave the Fantastic Four another obstacle to deal with, so that while we were in between the surfer scenes, they weren't just dealing with the normal wedding stuff. They had kind of some life or death stuff here, because them going back and forth and them changing the powers, to me, is strictly out of the comic books in terms of tone. That was my DP with the camera that just left frame.
Why does this always happen to me?
All of Sue's results are normal. Johnny's.
You know, as we continue to have the power switch with the guys, the stab at showing the molecules and how they're going back and forth, the unstable version of it was once again just another thing that we tried to constantly try to explain what's going on with their bodies. I know people always ask, well, why didn't Ben go red and go on fire? And, you know, obvious reasons. We just didn't want the scene to become about a shirt going up in flames and that kind of stuff. We wanted to get to what the scene ultimately was about, and that was Johnny becoming what he's constantly, you know, made fun of in Ben's world. It's funny in this shirt, you know, we get him out of the makeup, and then we give him a shirt that's got all these hard ridges because it's been burned. So either he's suffocating or he's being scratched to death. That idea of seeing Ben actually become the Thing on screen was always a cool image that luckily we were able to do in this movie. You saw it a lot in the comic books, but of course you didn't see it on screen in the first movie, but I definitely wanted to be sure we got to it this time, just because what they can do with the morphing and people becoming whatever, it's so seamless now. So, of course, this is the scene that first sets up the fact that they are going to quit being superheroes, which ultimately they decide against it when, of course, they save the world and find out that without them being who they were, all of mankind could have perished. So they find an importance in doing what they do. And, of course, Johnny overhearing this, obviously, is so we can set up, you know, the conflict that's going to happen between the guys throughout the rest of the movie.
People.
So, of course, Whistler, or up around Whistler, that is going to be used for Greenland. There's some beautiful stuff up in Canada as far as snow caps. And here we are to the first real look at a crater, and this crater is supposed to go miles down into the center of the Earth, which allows, you know, Galactus, when he arrives, to literally plug in and pull all the ingredients out of the center of the Earth up into his very being. The look of Doom, you know, this look was inspired by one of the comic books where it showed Doom's body and his face scarred from the burn that he's gone through, or the heat blast that Johnny gave him in the first film. And I always wanted to keep it kind of mysterious, kind of the hermit kind of thing.
Talents.
So the first realization of the Surfer's comic blast, which of course is one of the main powers that he has throughout the comics, It took us a long time to get, what we thought we were happy with. And of course, this idea of Doom being cured by the Surfer for the most part, since the same power is what woke him up. Now that he has had specific contact with the Surfer's powers, we show that it starts to bring him back to his normal state, which of course later we will see him enter into the story.
Dynamic duo.
Well, of course, this was, I felt, a necessary piece of information in showing that the Surfer has been to many galaxies, and the fact that Reed Richards has found out this information by his, many gadgets and vast knowledge of what the solar system is made out of. So we definitely used this scene to primarily show that the craters are actually going into the center of the Earth, and the fact that there are many, and hopefully you gave the audience some insight on what's happening.
They're appearing in a numerical sequence. The last crater was formed in Greenland, so the next in the sequence should be latitude 51 degrees, 30 minutes north, longitude 0 degrees, 7 minutes west.
It's the London Eye. It's interesting. This sequence was actually originally designed to be at the front of the movie when the Surfer was flying in and out of all the cities, and he was supposed to actually go by a carnival of some sort and have the Ferris wheel start to fall, and they happen to be there in their normal plain clothes and end up saving lives, and then of course going on to get on the airplane and go back home. This idea, at some point, it was just a small Ferris wheel, and we decided to go after the biggest one. And so once we made it the biggest in the world, it made it a very complicated and expensive sequence, and we decided to move it back and make it one of our main action sequences. The idea that the Surfer can, under any surface, be working and creating these craters, and the idea of having these craters that you're going to see all over the world, how do you make some of them different? And so we immediately thought, this guy probably, he can breathe in space. He can definitely breathe underwater and anything else. And so we immediately put him underwater, which we thought would just make that story point pretty serious. Most of this is CGI. What you see right there is actually a CGI wheel. This, once again, is a CGI wheel that they basically take and paint out the real one and then use their own. I must point out that the actors and myself never stepped foot in London to create this sequence, and we had to definitely figure out how to make all this work. So much of this stuff is done on green screen, and of course this idea that he's created a crater and now it is flowing into it was, once again, the backstory of the Surfer. This idea coming up of her standing on her own little force field, for those of you who do know the comics know that Sue probably is the most powerful out of all of them, because she can not only, go invisible and create force fields, but it also gives her the ability to fly for the most part. And so this was a little wink to the other powers that she actually does possess, which allows her to levitate and all of that. And although I wasn't able to go 100% with the idea, for those who do know her powers, will see a little bit of a hint of what she can do. once again the reveal that the crater has drained the Thames. This was an idea that that I really got into at some point, is to have the guys working together to solve this problem, because you couldn't have Victor on the outside of this story too long. What was the best way to bring him into the interior of the story and for him to have information and also his own ulterior motive, I guess you might say, which was to steal the board for himself ultimately. This is the first introduction of this. That, of course, Julian McMahon had a ball doing. He really gets into being this character. He's such a great Doctor Doom, in my opinion. Of course, a wink back to the first film and the fact that they had a relationship.
We need to.
It's funny. We had a very hard time scheduling Julian for the shoot. He was shooting his show, and throughout this whole film, we had to get him for days here, days there, one day here, one day there. We even had to think of alternate ways of shooting Victor throughout this whole movie. And at some point, it was actually an idea that Victor Von Doom would have his mask and cape and everything on the whole time. And at some point, we found that might be a little bit too much to watch, a guy in armor the whole movie. So we decided not to do it. But it was all just in an attempt to be able to have Doom, because in my opinion, he did serve a lot of plot, and I couldn't just write him out. And because we're already familiar with his relationship, so at some point he was gonna have the whole mask on, which would allow us to get a stand-in. Then, of course, we could just use Julian's voice later. Now, this next little part of the scene coming up, I've been approached by a lot of fanboys, and they always wondered if I was hinting to a storyline that was brought out in the comics where Johnny and Alicia actually had a little bit of a relationship, as you might say. And I think it later found out that she is actually a scroll or something like that. I can't remember exactly the story, but this was not really, in the back of my head, maybe a wink to it, but I was never going to take that idea of Johnny and Alicia coming together as a real thing. I only just wanted to kind of wink at it, and I think it came across. There's a subplot we dropped very early on, which involved that moment where Chris says it's nice to have somebody, that we were going to do more of a romantic thing with he and Bo, who plays Frankie Ray. But at some point we decided, it just wasn't Johnny's character to want to be connected to one woman. He's a playboy, and we needed to keep him true to John Storm.
You're gonna find the answer.
There always has to be a machine in these comic book movies. And here's another one of our gadgets, as the studio likes to call them, a goober. We always have these goobers in the movies, but we did need to create this idea that they could actually separate the surfer. One of the things that I thought about very early on with this movie is that the surfer is so powerful that you have to separate him. You have to make him powerless in the movie at some point. The same holds true for the original story of the surfer coming to Earth, where he, falls and Alicia helps him. You have to weaken him at some point. And so this idea that he could be separated from the board seemed like the only logical thing, because what else? Well, how else could you simply explain the idea that he was going to lose his power, and that was to have something that he has to be away from. And since the surfboard was such a specific thing, you had the man, you had the surfboard. It seems pretty clear that you separate those two, something's off. So we used that idea. This whole scene, if you remember the beginning of the scene where he's looking in the machine, a little bit of a jump cut to me, because I've always gone back and forth with this idea of him being cured by the surfer. I never liked it. I actually wanted to mess with a subplot that maybe he had created some type of skin so that he could actually appear to be normal, when in actuality, underneath the skin, he is metal. He is still this being that we know as Dr. Doom. And I will even say further to that idea, originally, but nobody went for it, is I wanted to actually make Dr. Doom a Doombot. I wanted to actually have this Doom show up and at some point gets into some type of fight with one of the Fan Four, and maybe Ben puts his hand right through Victor's face, and you find out that it's a machine, and that Victor Von Doom has been orchestrating this whole thing from a Doombot. But it started to become too much, so I had to kind of back off that idea.
This is not a game.
Frankie Ray, the idea that she could become the Nova and at some point become a Herald of Galactus is all a little bit of a wink to the comic book material, and the fact that here she ultimately becomes one of Johnny's girls. And why not? Because most of us comic book fanboys and geeks know the story of that.
Signal, get out of the way and let us do our job.
You don't understand.
No, you don't understand. So let me make it clear for you and your pack of freaks here. I'm the quarterback.
I will say the concept of this next outburst by Reed is totally taken from another one of the comic books, in which Reed goes off on Nick Fury of S.H.I.E.L.D. and goes off and says something about you better do what I say. Of course, what he says here. So we did our own version of it, but it's inspired by the comic book. In fact, the character of General Hager actually comes from my, originally I wanted Nick Fury to be the general that they were trotting around the Earth trying to figure out what's going on with the surfer. And at some point they wouldn't give me Nick Fury because they're planning on doing a S.H.I.E.L.D. movie. So I had to kind of come up with my own general, my own character that would serve at that point.
Some respect.
Well, you might recognize these as we call it the X-Men forest because I think they used it in all three of the X-Men movies. But we were in the same place. I used a lot of the same crew that I call it our sister franchise because they did one, then they did two, then we did Fan 4 1, then they did X3, then we did Fan 4 2. So literally it was going back and forth. And so that same crew was pretty much together throughout all of those films. So I like to call it our sister or brother. I probably should say brother franchise. This concept of a bear came from we were just out doing a tech scout, and I said something like, "Wouldn't it be funny if he was out there and a bear came and he scared it off?" A couple of people laughed, and I said, "You know what? That'd be kind of a cool idea. That you got to keep trying to find ways that you can't get so caught up in plot. In my belief, in this kind of film, and you don't want to forget the fact of you need little humor, little things here and there because it just keeps the tone of the fan for alive." And yeah, I think it was cool. I don't think it too many problems.
Almost there.
And once again, it gets back to the idea that he can bend matter and change matter, and these trees, which would never bend like this, of course, he can just move them out the way.
Right now.
This environment seems to be the best for the surfer we found just because of, I guess, the silver against dark always made him show up better. And here's one of these little magic moments that just, we didn't originally shoot this for him to go through her force field. And while we were in post, I had this idea that, wouldn't it be cool if he broke straight through her force field? She put it up to protect herself. And so once again, it's one of those moments that just pretty much comes out of being in the moment. So pretty much speaks for itself. It's just trying to show the power of the surfer, and able to get into what these cosmic blasts can actually do.
Well, let me just... No, wait.
And of course, the change of look for the surfer, we tried early on to figure out, okay, if we were going to have him be separated from the board, how do we dramatically or visually take advantage of him being separated? And the idea came up that, that he tarnishes just like you would if you had a piece of silver or a trophy or something like that was left on a shelf. It goes black, and we kind of took that same idea in terms of, the idea of chrome or steel or whatever you want to call it, that he would go into this darker version of himself. And I thought it was a perfect way to illustrate the fact that he was weakened. It's interesting. This day it snowed. We wanted it to snow. We were prepared to make our own snow, and showed up on the set. And that night it actually snowed. It was kind of tripped everybody out. So this is the hint now where we start to really get into the real villain who's going to show up for the third act. In working out the structure of the story, I always knew it was a situation where at some point the Surfer, as he is in the comic books, he becomes an ally of the Fantastic Four, that you needed to take a moment to have him start to change, to give a moment where he would change his mind. And so, of course, this starts it. Once he's technically captured, he is no longer the threat, and we have to transfer the threat to another character. And of course, that's why Victor Von Doom is in the movie, is so that in the third act, we have something else to deal with. You know, Galactus is one thing, but Galactus is kind of something they cannot fight. So Doom definitely became the antagonist for the film at that point. Before this, he was just kind of like searching for information. But of course, once he starts to put his plan together about stealing the board, he becomes a threat.
He thinks you're cute. There's a lot more going on here. Now, he said he wasn't the destroyer.
Maybe he lied.
Constantly, we're trying to figure out different ways to use their powers just so that you don't get sick of seeing the same thing. And so it really dawned on me that technically, you know, she could make any wall invisible, which gives her x-ray vision, as you might say. Of course, if she's making the wall invisible, if somebody was looking at her, they could see her through the wall, or if she's invisible, of course, they couldn't see her. They would just see a hole in the wall. So once again, it's just an idea to try to continuously come up with new ways of using their powers, and thus make it a little bit more, interesting as we go from movie to movie.
What's your name?
It's funny. We thought long and hard about how to actually, in what configuration to strap him to this gurney. At one point, my production designer wanted to strap him almost like Christ on the cross, and I just couldn't go there, just because in the past people have kind of insinuated that the story of the surfer was a little bit like Jesus Christ, and I knew immediately we couldn't. I didn't want to go into that. I didn't want to make this film about religion and this and that. But there's always been this kind of undertone of that. And so many of my guys on the set tried to go a little bit farther with that. But I never thought that was the direction to go.
By many names.
Early on, I thought that, the surfer might have this power that he could actually project images on his outer skin. But I always thought it would be more or less when he was actually silver. And so when he lost his power here, I did run into the problem of, okay, where does he get the power to actually project this image on himself? And I had to just kind of suspend the disbelief of him being able to do it. And I just went on to do it because technically I needed to get that information across, and he needed to be able to show Sue what was actually going to happen. It wasn't enough for him to just tell her. He needed her to see it so she had a clear idea of what was going to happen in the event they did not get the board back and stop Galactus. So, of course, a lot of people didn't catch this, that this is the horns of, or the helmet of Galactus on Saturn right there. And the fact that, Galactus is so huge that he literally, the way he travels, he can break up the rings of Saturn. we really wanted to, start to introduce Galactus at that point. And I think here's where we start the ticking clock that Earth is about to be consumed. And if they don't do something quick, there's going to be a true problem. If people look closely, you'll see the two guards to the side who actually have two cases. Those cases actually house the mask and everything else that Doom will ultimately be using, which he has said that this is his equipment, but in actuality, it is his uniform that he will soon put on as he becomes Dr. Doom. Thus begins our villain for the third act. The big moment of seeing the mask. We totally redesigned the mask. Once again, we didn't worry about how it was redesigned. We just decided to, try to improve where we can. With the first film, I couldn't really explain where he might get this ultimate uniform. I had to kind of piece it together so it looked like he pieced it together. But with this film, I wanted to go all the way to what I thought Doom ultimately should have always looked like in terms of the cloak, and chose not to go totally with the green because I didn't think it was necessary, but definitely thought, let's make Doom badass like we know he could be. And this whole idea of him riding on the surfboard is taken specifically from the comic books, where there are issues where Doom actually steals a surfboard and flies on the surfboard, just like the surfer. And once again, it was something that I wasn't sure if people were going to go for, because when you're first talking about the idea of this, it seems kind of silly to say, yeah, so Doom's going to be on the surfboard and surfing. And it felt a little odd, but at the same time, I did feel as if we could definitely take it to this one on here. This was an idea that I came up with on set just while we were coming around the corner. I needed them not to get so quickly to the chamber. And at first I was going to have Johnny do like a little bit of torch thing where he just kind of like pretty much torch a circle and then Ben would have kicked it through. But how do I show the power that Doom has right now, and also maybe take advantage of it and get a little gag in here, which might make, people laugh a little bit. I constantly look for moments to continue the Fantastic Four tone and find ways to have fun with it and hopefully not stop the story from going forward. And enter the Fantastic Car. The Fantastic Car this design was one of the first things that we all approved. I figured it out fairly early on with a guy by the name of Tim Flattery, who worked on one of the Batmobiles in the original Batman series that I think was done by either Tim Burton or Schumacher. I don't remember which one, but we came up with this concept, and at some point it worked perfectly. Once again, here is another idea of trying to give Sue ways to use her powers differently.
General Hager.
People would always say, well, Tim, would they really stop with this girl just with a little gun? Couldn't they just kind of like flick her aside and go? But I always thought of it as they owe her an explanation. I didn't want her character to just kind of disappear without any kind of presence, or any kind of reason. So I chose to kind of for them to run into her and then her give permission for them to go off and hopefully save the world. And the fifth member of the Fantastic Four, the Fantastic Car, finally shows up. And I must admit, this was something that I tried to get into the first film, but it made absolutely no sense for them to have it in the first film. But in this film, I just knew I had to have the Fantastic Car, and luckily everybody else was on the same page. If you look at the deleted scenes, you'll see a scene in which they were supposed to rescue the surfer up in the air in midair, in mid-flight. And that sequence was pretty much designed for the Fantastic Car. So we had to come up with some other reason. And then once we got into the concept of splitting pods and splitting the car up, we really got into, the action sequence you're about to see in which Doom attacks the guys.
What?
I must admit, this has been one of the fun things to do, and that is to have Johnny torched on and just flying, like it's no big deal. It's always been a fun thing to present, and luckily we were able to do it with this movie. And here we go. We call it the Uber Doom throughout the whole film, so we could differentiate from the regular Doom and the Uber version of himself. I even remember people asking me very early on, why does the car only split up in 3 parts? And of course, it had always been because Johnny flies. And why would Reed think to make a separate pod? Because in the event they were going to split up, Johnny can fly. So there would be no reason for him to have his own craft. Also, I knew that he would be flying and that, I didn't want to have 4 pieces and the surfer wasn't going to be flying one of them. So that was a design early on that it only go into 3 parts. And this is us just playing, when it comes to what powers Victor ultimately has. It was so hard to define everything the surfer could or could not do. And in this situation, we started to get into a point where we could just kind of come up with whatever we needed to use to work for the story. And once again, this keeps in with the whole idea that we want it to be all over the world. As we talked about where they might ultimately have the last fight, it came up that possibly we could do it in Shanghai. And so we immediately went into preparing that. Now, what you'll see coming soon is that although we are in the streets of Vancouver, we actually took certain buildings from Hong Kong and actually put them in Shanghai. The skyline for Shanghai is actually pretty sparse, and the big needle that you're going to see soon, we needed more buildings around it to create the right fighting area. So we kind of mixed the cities. And enter Galactus. This has been much talked about on the boards and blogs. And, we decided early on that we would not bring him to life completely as you might think of him in the comics, meaning a man with the suit and the helmet and everything else. And one of the main reasons is because we always knew there was going to be a Silver Surfer 1, or they were going to make a spinoff of the Silver Surfer. And if I gave up everything in this movie, then that movie, wouldn't have much to go on. And knowing that I wasn't going to do it that early, I wanted to keep it fairly open to interpretation by the director that would do that one. So the idea of the cloud and everything made pretty good sense to us, because early on I had to ask myself, if he's going to suck a planet dry of all its matter, all its energy, what would that look like? In the comic book, sometimes he has a little, Galactus would have a little metal box, and we didn't even know what the metal box did. So early on, we decided that Galactus needed to be more substantial, and I didn't want to get into a machine, but at the same time, I didn't want it to be completely devoid of machinery. So we decided to cover him in clouds. The fight between Johnny and Doom, at some point we tried to figure out, how do we make this switching of powers, help us in the third act. And I remember looking at the Super Scrolls and I said, you know what? This idea that Johnny has all of their powers just seemed to be a cool thing, because one thing that I ran into with the first film is anytime the four of them are fighting one villain, no matter what's going on, they look weak. And I decided early on that I needed to have a one-on-one fight, and it made sense that Johnny in some way get all of their powers and then fights Doom one-on-one. And so that was the choice for what you saw there. Here once again is the idea, the concept of Galactus. The way we looked at it is there, and if you look closely into some of these shots later with the Silver Surfer, you will see that there is actually a skeletal kind of, organic machinery going on behind the cloud. And I didn't want to show it all, so I shrouded it in a lot of substance. But if you look closely, at times you will see that there is structure behind there, and we continue to hint at the fact that there's something behind this cloud, but we just don't show it. Coming up is another famous moment with the Surfer, and I wanted so much, and I even had it mixed in there one time for the Surfer to say, "Come to me, my board," which is something that he often said in the comic books. And at some point, it just felt like it was too much. This felt enough to the fact that he was calling the board to come to him. But at one point, I did have it mixed into the movie, but it just felt like it wasn't necessary. In the comic books, another thing that I read and kind of, took creative license on is the fact that it says specifically in some of the literature that it is not known whether he can actually bring life from a dead object or a dead being. And then maybe some other literature you might find, it says he cannot do it. But I found that dramatically I needed that moment. I needed him to have that power, and the fact that him bringing life back would weaken him considerably. Thus, you get the tarnishing that you see from him. But we decided to use it because it worked for us dramatically. And here we are with what we consider Galactus. To a certain degree, we did not answer the question that, is this Galactus? Is that piece right there Galactus? We still leave it open to interpretation for the director that would do the Surfer movie, that Galactus has a machine. He has machinery behind him, whether Galactus is a huge being and this actual tendril that's coming down to suck up the planet is actually a part of him. We wanted to kind of be vague with that and not answer the question. As you see him go into here, it can be argued that all of this is Galactus, or Galactus is a being behind this. And as you can see the helmet here, we always wanted to kind of, hint at the fact that there is something behind all of this. It's not like it's just a big cloud, which everybody wanted to get up in arms about. All the choices we made were very specific. And I believe, in my opinion, this was not the movie to go that far into what the being of Galactus would be. The idea that Galactus is fighting back as the surfer goes to do what he's doing is what you saw from that shot, that very close shot of what was going on. Of looking at like it was protruding. Now, of course, the question is always, okay, did he destroy Galactus? In my opinion, he did not. As you get into this kind of movie, you start to ask yourself, how can I deal with Galactus at the end? How do you defeat Galactus? And just as the surfer might travel through wormholes, we felt since his power is from Galactus, he's pretty powerful. And why couldn't he send Galactus almost into like a black hole? It's not as if he killed Galactus. It is, in my opinion, that he sent him away, quote unquote. And definitely possible that the Earth will see Galactus again. Not anytime soon. And of course, the story point of Johnny going up to help the surfer so that at some point in that exchange, he was the power of him switching with these guys would be taken away.
Now you're making me uncomfortable.
Another point of just trying to build up the brother and sister relationship and just show that they truly are a close family, and happy that they've made it. And of course, early on, the idea was always that, in order to have their, wedding happen, is that they would skip off somewhere real private and just make it a really, really simple wedding. And it's kind of like the point is that they've tried to have these big weddings, and the way for them to do it, as I think a lot of celebrities might do, is that you have to sometimes just make it a small, uncomplicated event. Love these. Brian here, who plays the preacher, he was to me, he was a real find, because I thought he gave a very subtle comical performance in it, and I think it worked totally for the tone of this movie. And you always look for characters, when you have characters like this that don't have a lot of screen time, you definitely want to try to find interesting actors to play them, because they often are what have to bring the thing to that part. This was a little gag that we went back and shot after we had shot the original photography. We were looking for something to end the movie with a little bit of a laugh. And I thought this worked. It was typical Johnny, and we also didn't want to 100% say that Johnny has changed and is going to become this married guy, but I thought we had a lot of fun with it. And of course, a cool use of the splitting up car, and basically we're out. You know, I knew we had to end this movie with some four. You had to do it's almost like ending the Batman movies with always the symbol that's shown into the sky. You had to do it with the four. Something that I wanted to do very early on is have some version of the surfer so that you know it's not over. And here we had this idea that his eyes open and you know he's coming back. Well, there you are. There's the Rise of the Silver Surfer. Hopefully you had a good time. Thanks for joining. It's Tim's Story. Out.